It is the morning of the 18th of January in the year 532 after Christ, and the most powerful man in the eastern Mediterranean world is standing in a private chamber of the great palace of Constantinople, packing a small bag. He is Justinian, Emperor of the Romans. He is 50 years old. He has ruled for 5 years. Outside the palace walls, the city is burning. For 5 days, mobs of 40,000 armed citizens have been moving through the streets, setting fire to public buildings, killing imperial officials, and chanting the name of a rival they intend to set on the throne. The cathedral of Hagia Sophia is a pile of charred timbers. The Senate house has been leveled. The hippodrome is full of insurgents. The imperial guard has refused to fight them. Justinian's senior generals have advised him to leave by boat tonight, across the Bosphorus, with his treasury, his nephew, and what is left of his court, to retreat to one of the eastern provinces, regroup, and possibly return in a few years if the situation in the capital settled. He has agreed. The ships are waiting. He has called, before he leaves, a small council of his closest advisers, 8 men, all senators, all of whom have agreed with the generals, and he has called, as he calls them to every important decision he has ever made, his wife. Her name is Theodora. She is 32 years old. She was, 12 years ago, an actress in a public theatre. She is about to walk into that chamber, sit down on the small gilt chair beside the emperor, and say something that will save the Eastern Roman Empire for another 900 years. This is the story of her. To understand what Theodora was about to do, you have to understand where she had come from. She had been born, around the year 500 after Christ, into the lowest stratum of imperial society. Her father, a Cypriot named Acacius, was a bearkeeper at the hippodrome of Constantinople. He worked, specifically, for the Green Faction, one of the 2 great chariot racing organizations that ran public entertainment in the capital and that effectively functioned as the city's 2 political parties. He died, in an accident, when Theodora was about 4 years old. Her mother, also working at the hippodrome, in some kind of theatrical capacity, was left with 3 small daughters and no means of support. The Greens refused to give her her husband's pension. She walked her 3 daughters out into the central spina of the hippodrome between races, dressed them in mourning garlands, and held them up before the seated crowd as a public appeal. The Blues, the rival faction, took her in. Theodora and her sisters were raised as blue partisans. They were also raised, by their mother's profession, in the world of the Byzantine stage. The Byzantine stage was not, by Roman or Christian standards of the period, a respectable profession. It was assumed, by every law in the imperial code, that an actress was, by the nature of her work, also a prostitute. The 2 were not legally separated. A woman who appeared on stage in any capacity was, in the eyes of the law, infamous, a person without civic standing, ineligible to marry a senator, ineligible to inherit property by will, ineligible to give legal testimony. Theodora went on stage at the age of about 10. By her early teens she was, according to the hostile but detailed account of the historian Procopius, the most famous mime actress in Constantinople, celebrated for a stage version of the myth of Leda and the Swan that was apparently, by the standards of any period, indecent. But that is not the strangest part. She left the stage in her late teens. She left it, by her own later account, after a religious conversion. She had gone to North Africa, to the province of Cyrenaica, as the mistress of a low-level imperial governor named Hycebalus. He had abandoned her, somewhere in the desert. She had walked back to Constantinople. She had stopped, in the city of Alexandria, at the monastic community of the Egyptian Desert Fathers. A Coptic monk called Severus, the deposed patriarch of Ansh, had taken her in. He had taught her. He had baptized her into the Miaphysite branch of the Christian faith, the version held by the Egyptian and Syrian provinces of the empire, considered heretical by the Greek-speaking Constantinople establishment. When she returned to Constantinople, around the year 521, when she was about 21 years old, she was no longer an actress. She was working as a wool spinner in a small house near the imperial palace. She was deeply religious. She was supporting herself, by every contemporary account, in absolute poverty. She was also, in some manner that the surviving sources never quite explain, introduced to the heir to the imperial throne. His name was Justinian. He was the nephew of the reigning emperor Justin I, a former peasant, illiterate, who had risen by sheer competence through the army to take the throne in his late 60s. Justinian was 20 years older than her. He was the second most powerful man in the empire. He had been preparing for his uncle's eventual death to take the throne himself. He fell in love with her. What happened next changed everything. The problem was the law. The law of the Eastern Roman Empire absolutely forbade a senator, let alone a member of the imperial family, from marrying a woman who had ever appeared on the public stage. It was one of the foundational categories of Roman civic law, in force, in some form, for the previous 500 years. It was not negotiable. Justinian asked his uncle to change it. His uncle did. The Empress Euphemia, the wife of Justin I, herself a former barbarian slave girl from the Upper Danube, died, conveniently, in 524. Justin then issued a new constitution, the Lex de Nuptiis, which permitted, by imperial decree, the marriage of senators to former actresses provided the actress had renounced her former profession and provided the emperor personally authorized the union. The law was written, in extremely careful language, to cover exactly one case. Justinian married Theodora in 525. 3 years later, his uncle died. Justinian was crowned emperor of the Romans. And the woman who had been, 15 years earlier, the most famous mime actress in the capital was crowned, in the cathedral of Hagia Sophia, Augusta and co-empress of the Romans. But that is still not the strangest part. She did not behave as a consort. By every account that has survived, the hostile gossip of Procopius, the official chronicles of the court, the proceedings of the imperial bureaucracy, Theodora ruled. She had her own separate court at the palace. She had her own foreign ambassadors. She had her own correspondence with the bishops and provincial governors of the empire. She received foreign embassies independently of her husband. She personally drafted, with her own household lawyers, the social legislation of the reign, the codes regulating marriage, divorce, female property rights, the trafficking of women, the legal age of marriage for girls, the protection of women's rights in inheritance. Almost every piece of social legislation passed under Justinian's name in the next 30 years was, by the assessment of modern scholars working from the surviving drafts, written by Theodora. She also, in religious policy, ran a parallel imperial line. Justinian was Chalcedonian. He was, by training and conviction, on the Greek-speaking side of the great 6th century theological dispute about the nature of Christ. Theodora was Miaphysite. She was, by her conversion in Alexandria, on the side held by the Egyptian, Syrian, and Armenian provinces. She did not give it up. She kept, openly, a private monastery of Miaphysite refugee monks in her own apartments in the imperial palace. She kept, when the imperial police came to arrest the Miaphysite patriarch of Antioch on her husband's orders, the patriarch hidden under her own roof for 12 years. She funded, with imperial money channeled through her own household, the building of monasteries and schools in the eastern provinces by the very religious community her husband's official policy was trying to suppress. It is the only sustained instance in late Roman history of a co-monarchy in which the two monarchs ran two opposing religious policies in parallel, in public, for 30 years, and did not divorce. Nobody knew, in the streets of Constantinople, quite how to read it. But on the 18th of January, in the year 532, that long preparation came to its single defining moment. The riot had begun, 6 days earlier, as a quarrel at the chariot races. A pair of condemned criminals, one a blue partisan, one a green, had been hanged outside the city walls. The rope had broken on both of them. They had fallen alive, been carried by the crowd into a nearby monastery, and refused sanctuary. The two great factions of the hippodrome, for the only time in their history, had united. They had demanded the criminals be pardoned. The emperor had refused. The factions had erupted. They had named themselves the Nika, victory, and had begun to burn the city. By the 5th day, the Senate had been dissolved by violence. The most prominent of Justinian's official enemies, the nephews of the previous emperor Anastasius, had been brought, against their will, to the hippodrome and crowned on the imperial throne by the rioting crowd. Justinian's 8 advisers, the city prefect, the commander of the imperial guard, the praetorian prefect, had all agreed, the emperor must flee tonight, by ship, across the Bosphorus, to safety in Anatolia. He had agreed. The ships were waiting. Theodora had said nothing through the meeting. When the council reached its consensus, she stood up. She was wearing the imperial purple. She walked to the center of the small gilt chamber. She turned to face the emperor and the assembled senators. She spoke. Procopius, who hated her, and who had no reason to flatter her, preserved what she said. She said, "I do not know whether the present moment is the right moment for a woman to give her opinion. But there is an old saying, that the imperial purple is the noblest shroud. If, then, you wish to save your life, my lord, you will have no difficulty. We are wealthy, the sea is at hand, the ships are ready. But think whether, when you are once a refugee, you will not gladly exchange that safety for death. As for me, I agree with the old saying. The purple is the best burial sheet." The emperor stayed. The imperial guard, called back into the city under the command of the general Belisarius, swept through the hippodrome that afternoon. They killed, by the conservative estimate of the chroniclers, 30,000 insurgents in the space of 3 hours. The two rival emperors crowned by the mob were captured and executed. The riot ended. The throne of Constantinople, and through it, the Eastern Roman Empire, survived for another 921 years, until the Ottoman conquest of 1453. It survived because, on the 18th of January in 532, a 32-year-old former actress had told her husband, in a small gilt chamber in the imperial palace, that he would rather die in the purple than live as a refugee. She lived for 17 more years. She continued to run her parallel court, her parallel religious policy, her parallel diplomatic correspondence, her parallel social legislation. She funded the rebuilding of Hagia Sophia in the new vast geometric form, the largest church in the world for 1,000 years, that the riot had cleared the ground for. Her portrait, in golden mosaic, was placed on the wall of the Church of San Vitale at Ravenna by an imperial commission in the year 547. It is still there. You can stand in front of it. She died of breast cancer in the year 548 at the age of 48. Justinian wore mourning for the rest of his life. He never remarried. He continued, for the remaining 17 years of his own reign, to issue laws drafted by her household. The Miaphysite monks she had hidden in her apartments were given imperial funds for their monasteries, openly, by the emperor's signed authority, for the rest of his reign. The Patriarch of Anjou, the religious enemy whose life she had saved by hiding him under her own roof for 12 years, was permitted to live out the rest of his life in quiet exile, with an imperial pension. She is, by the assessment of every modern historian who has studied the Byzantine 6th century, the the most consequential empress in the 1,000-year history of the empire. Her portrait at Ravenna shows a small woman with very large, very dark eyes, wearing the purple. She is not smiling. She is looking very steadily, very directly, at whoever is standing in front of her. She knew, when the mosaic was made, what she had done. If this story stayed with you, there are dozens more like it, quiet voices from the long edge of empires that almost fell. Every week another. Hit subscribe and the lamps stay lit a while longer. Sleep well.